Hello, I'm Dr. Keith Martin, the Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, and welcome to our leadership series. I'm really delighted today to have two experts on addressing a neglected but vital challenge that affects all of us. We all know the existential challenge that climate change poses, and thankfully that's getting more attention. But what is underappreciated and neglected is the biodiversity crisis, the sixth extinction crisis that we are in today, when 1 out of every 8 species is potentially going to go extinct in the near future. And we're not only losing species, but we're also individuals in those species are becoming fewer and their size is becoming smaller. This has enormous implications for our health, our well-being, our security. And in fact, the shredding of the fragile network of life on Earth is a global challenge to all of us. In 1948, the International Conservation of Nature was created. Sorry, the International Conservation, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, my apologies, IUCN, was created. And it is made up of over 18,000 scientists and 1,500 organizations around the world. And it's mandated to provide the tools to enable us to have a sustainably developed future and to be able to protect ecosystems around the world and all that lives within them. And two experts today to discuss what they do and why this is important. The first is Professor Emily Nicholson. Professor Nicholson is a professor in conservation science at Deakin University in Australia. She creates tools for decision makers that decision makers can use in making sound, effective environmental decisions. Next is Professor David Keith. Professor Keith is a professor of botany at the Center for Ecosystem Sciences at the University of New South Wales. He is a foremost expert in plant ecology. Professor Nicholson and Professor Keith, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And they're coming all the way from Australia to speak to us today. So if I can start off with the first thing, please, Professor Nicholson, explain to us, please, what the IUCN is.
Well, the IUCN is a unique organisation. It's a membership union, as you mentioned before, comprised of government and civil and society organisations. And it really provides this critical set of knowledge and tools and guidelines for improving nature conservation and sustainable development. And it's guided by input of experts who are largely on a volunteer basis, like David and I, who predominantly contribute through the IUCN commissions rather than as IUCN staff. So, for example, we co-lead the thematic group on the Red List of Ecosystems. And this is a really important partnership because it means that scientific excellence really feeds into everything that IUCN does, and it gives a really strong, credible foundation for their work.
That's great, and I'm glad you mentioned that the key issue we're going to talk today is that red list of ecosystems that both of you work on. Professor Keith, you've been one of the leaders in developing this. Can you tell us what the red list of critical ecosystems are?
Yeah, sure. And in the context of the IUCN, it's actually a significant development because the IUCN, being a union of government and non-government organisations, is effectively a primary a body that represents stakeholders and interests across the globe. And the union meets once every 4 years. It elects officials, and much like a Congress does, but it's a global Congress. And each of those 4 years, they get together and decide how they're going to tackle what they've identified as the world's major conservation problems. And in 2008, they did just that, and they decided that they needed a means of estimating risks to ecosystems around the world and a means of using that information about risks to ecosystems to make decisions. So in 2008, the Congress was at Barcelona, and that effectively or officially initiated our efforts to develop a brand new method for assessing risks to ecosystems. And many people may have heard of the older sibling of Red List of Ecosystems. That's the Red List of Threatened Species, which was had its roots back in the late 1950s, when there was mounting concern about the loss of essentially charismatic megafauna, where the world's mammals and birds were conspicuously under threat and declining and being lost. And it's developed from there through a number of iterations. And now in the 21st century, we've come to realise that as powerful tool that is for making decisions about conservation and reducing risks to individual species, there's a gap because it can't really deal with the broader scale issues that affect whole ecosystems, which ultimately circle back into the persistence of species themselves, because species depend on their habitats and other parts of the ecosystems, other species that they interact with, which is effectively what an ecosystem is. So the Red List of Ecosystems is the product of those research efforts from a partnership that was initiated from 2008, come up with a new means of developing risks to characterising and assessing risks to ecosystems. And what that meant was having a simple system of ranking according to broad levels of risk, from the highest category, critically endangered, through endangered and vulnerable, to least concern, those ecosystems that seem to be pretty stable. And risk is a concept that in essence means the probability of a bad event being realised, and over a particular time frame. And so one of the key conceptual steps in developing a Red List of Ecosystems was to understand what we were assessing the risks of. And so we defined this concept of ecosystem collapse, which is essentially a point where an ecosystem loses its identity and has lost some components of its biodiversity and also its functions in a way that it no longer resembles itself, and has undergone a transformation into a different ecosystem, which may of course have other values and other properties, but they're different from the ecosystem that one might assess the risks to. And so understanding the probability of that kind of transformation happening in ecosystems over essentially what we've decided as a 50-year time frame, because that seems to be the relevant time horizon for planning decisions and business decisions, and also fits quite nicely with the dynamics of many of the ecosystems that we're dealing with. The other important feature of the Red List of Ecosystems is that it's generic and flexible, and therefore applicable to every kind of ecosystem on Earth, right through from the highest mountains to the biggest forests, to the driest deserts, the deepest oceans, and rivers and lakes. So it's a generic threshold that allows assessors to think through a process to understand those risks and diagnose their causes, which is an important part of the assessment. And it's particularly critical because it's not enough just to know the risks of collapse of an ecosystem. We need to know what the next step is to reduce those risks. And the Red List framework is essentially developed to enable us to have that capacity to move forward on that next step.
And I think, to your point, it's very important to recognize and emphasize the fact that these ecosystems provide services for all life, including our own, but they're under threat, and those threats affect all of us. And I'd like Professor Nicholson, if you could follow along with what Professor Keith mentioned, and can you tell us what the scope of the losses are and the causes of those losses, please?
Yeah, you mentioned many of them in your opening comments. The biodiversity crisis is very well documented, and it's not hyperbolic to call it a crisis. It's been summarised really well in the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is the sibling to the IPCC, the better known IPCC on climate change. We refer to it as IPBES because it's such a mouthful. And they've written a series of excellent reports about change, a loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and also working with IPCC on a report on how that interacts with climate change, the two big existential crises that we face. So what do these reports tell us? So about half the extent of natural ecosystems have been lost over the last 200 years or so. 77% of land and 87% of the area of the oceans has been modified by human activity. You talked about some of the transformation for species. So we have about a quarter of species that have been assessed as being at risk or at risk of extinction. The biomass of wild mammals has declined by over 80% in my lifetime. And they've been replaced by humans and livestock. We now, along with our livestock, account for over 95% of mammal biomass, which is extraordinary. And just as a more specific example, we have coral reefs as this flagship ecosystem, which is affected by many threats. They're extraordinarily beautiful, full of wonder, and they're also really important to biodiversity and people. Live coral cover has halved over the last 150 years. And they bleach, as many of you would have seen, they bleach when there's high sea temperatures, and they can recover with time. But even with the 1.5 degree warming, we're going to see repeat coral bleaching that will take them potentially beyond their capacity to recover. And this is on top of other threats like pollution and overfishing. So this is just an example of a really iconic and important and valuable ecosystem that we risk losing along with all its species, just as an example to highlight the scope of the crisis.
And I think as you strongly emphasized, these changes are not over hundreds of years. The acute changes are really within our lifetimes. And the collapse of ecosystems is stunning in its degree and its impact upon the species of the planet, including our own, that live there. Although we are thriving, and as you mentioned, 95% of biomass is us and the animals we eat. Only a shocking 5% of mammal species is all that's left, right? That's remarkable. So, Professor Keith, you could connect this to the destruction of the ecosystems that you and Professor Nicholson have mapped out, the health of the ecosystems. What is the connection to climate change, both as making climate change worse, but what are the opportunities in terms of protecting them, as carbon sinks?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting question and subject to much active research around the world. And one of the reasons for that is that it's extremely challenging because the relationships are very, very complex. Not only is there simple sort of cause-effect chains, but there are feedback loops where some elements of the planetary system affect other elements. And sometimes we can hypothesize about those effects and perhaps predict them. In other cases, we don't learn about them until they're well underway and essentially almost impossible to reverse. So to give you an example, one of the effects of climate change involves acidification of the oceans. And what that means is that declining pH is affecting many marine animals that have calcium in their body structures, either as exoskeletons or shells, if you like. And coral itself, of course, includes a large component of calcium carbonate. Now, calcium carbonate, of course, has carbon, and it doesn't survive in an acid environment. It becomes soluble, and that increases the concentration of carbonate in the oceans, and ultimately that is carbon that must equilibrate and may end up back in the atmosphere, liberated, instead of being fixed in places like coral reefs and shellfish reefs and so on and so on. So that increasing carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, of course, reinforces climate change, and you get this positive feedback cycle. And the same kinds of cycles apply to ocean circulations, which affect temperatures in different parts of the world, melting ice caps and glaciers. All of those things involve quite complex feedbacks. And one of the corollaries of that is that the climate system globally, if there's one thing that we can say, we can certainly say that temperatures are warming. But the other thing that's perhaps received less attention that is really quite certain is that the climate's becoming more variable. And we're seeing that, that play out through extreme events, such as forest fires, in Europe, in South America, North America, Australia, and indeed Southeast Asia, and even parts of Africa. And you know, those events relate to extreme fire weather. The projections are, and the evidence in the trajectories that we've been measuring in recent decades show that the frequency and the severity of that extreme fire weather is increasing with time. And we can link that mechanistically to climate change as the cause. Other kinds of events, you know, include cyclonic storms, hurricanes, and extreme rainfall events. We've just had one of those in, we're still having actually, one of those in southeastern Australia as I speak, that has enormous economic implications. So the value of ecosystems in all of this is something that plays out at a number of different levels. At the planetary level, ecosystems are incredibly important as a source of carbon sequestration. Our forests in particular, and also our oceans, actually lock up a lot of carbon that could end up in the atmosphere. But as long as those forests continue to function and exist, and as long as the oceans continue to function and their structures exist in the way that they have done in the past, then that carbon stays safely locked up. So in a global sense, and this is nothing new, we hear about the importance of large forests like the Amazon and Southeast Asia all the time. The function of the climate really depends on the continuity and function of those very large systems. Now, I guess our problem in governance is that, you know, there isn't a single decision maker who makes decisions about whether to maintain those ecosystems or not. And this is where scale comes in, because many decisions are made about ecosystem management, at least, and which are bound up very tightly with economic and social decisions, are actually made at quite local levels, sometimes by national governments, and sometimes by local actors and operators. And they can have significant consequences at a local scale, but the important point is that those are additive, and lots of those little decisions and actions add up to very large trends, which is why we're seeing the erosion of these massive global assets like the Amazon rainforests and the Great Barrier Reef and so on. It's actually about local actions that individually look pretty small, and frankly they are. But in conservation science, for a long time, we've nicknamed this kind of process death by 1,000 cuts, because many independent decisions are adding up to an adverse outcome that benefits nobody. Yeah. I'll just add quickly that, you know, there are lots of other benefits of ecosystems that pertain to human health and well-being. Many livelihoods depend on functioning ecosystems to provide goods and services, wood products, fuels, food, of course. Many of those are sourced from natural ecosystems, as are many of our pharmaceuticals and medicines come from ultimately ecosystem sources. And in terms of human well-being, we're learning very rapidly that mental health is critically linked to connections to nature, and the ability of humans to experience complexity and variety in their lives is absolutely critical to mental well-being. And this has really come to the fore during the COVID pandemic, when movement and access to nature has been much more restricted than it has been.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as a physician, the data shows that spending time in nature is equivalent to taking tricyclic antidepressants if you suffer from depression. So protecting green spaces are really important for people's everybody's mental health and well-being. I want to just, Professor Nicholson, on the death by 1,000 cuts and the destruction we're doing, I want to flip that around. If 1,000 actions are going to are just damaging the ecosystems around us and the services they provide for our health, conversely, 1,000 great actions would do the opposite of that. And what you all created are tools that governments and communities can use to protect their ecosystems. Can you share with us the tools that you have at the IUCN that policymakers can use at a national and local level to make better decisions for their communities with regard to protecting ecosystems?
And so IUCN has a range of, decision support tools or frameworks that can, first of all, help us to understand the state of the system and diagnose what's going wrong, like David mentioned before. And these, so this includes a red list of ecosystems, which can look at whole of ecosystem processes and functions and risks. And also we have the red list of threatened species that can help us understand how individual species are faring and identify the causes of those as well and the key threats. There's also a range of tools like key biodiversity areas that try to identify the important areas for biodiversity around the world. And together, these can help guide the decisions that we make. Risk level isn't a direct measure that we should work on threatened species. A whole lot of things that come into play, of course, the feasibility of acting, how well it's going to work, and the tools that are available for governments, but they provide a really important impetus for action and for understanding where the greatest risks are, and that's really important. There's also an increasing array of tools that can, for example, help us use ecosystem assessments from the red list of ecosystems to prioritise areas for restoration that can help guide where we should restore ecosystems to reduce their risk and to increase their flow of the benefits that they provide for people. And of course, just knowing more about what these benefits are is hugely informative as well. Things like where we need to place protected areas to help enhance fisheries that 400 million people depend on worldwide and provide so much of a nutritional value for people. And a lot of these actions from an ecosystem side of things really fall into two really broad categories. One is just actions to try and halt the further loss of ecosystems, and then actions to restore ecosystems, try and increase nature. The second one is much, much harder to do. It's equivalent to preventative health is going to be much better. So stopping ecosystems from being destroyed and degraded and eroded is going to be much more effective than trying to patch them up afterwards and try and restore them, because there are lots of time lags. It takes a long time for decades for ecosystems to recover to even something that resembles its original ecosystem, and often it'll never get back there. And so in that lag, there's a whole lot of different plants and animals that can't live in that system. For example, they might depend on really old trees, and those are lost. It's also very uncertain, but above all, it's really expensive as well. And so it's much, much better if we can prevent that loss in the first place.
What's the value proposition? What's the value? Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, please.
No, go. I was just going to add that at the moment, where the negotiations are underway for the global aspirations for the next decades for conservation, that's called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and that's under the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they've laid this out quite well. The different our aspiration is to live in harmony with nature. We have different goals, which are outcomes, and then there's a whole set of action targets, things that people can really do. Governments can do to reverse the loss of nature, and things like tackling pollution, deforestation, and acting on climate change. And I think that's a really important framework to really think about what we can do to reverse the loss of nature.
And I wanted just to add on one other thing, and you were kind enough to share a document from the IUCN on the role ecosystems play in pandemic prevention and reducing spillover. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that, since we have the lens on COVID-19 and how do we build forward better? Can you share with us the role that ecosystems play, intact ecosystems, in reducing spillover?
Yeah, I'm no expert in disease, but one of we know that deforestation is the leading, or habitat loss or land use change is the leading cause of loss of biodiversity. That was documented in IPBES's review. It's 35% at least loss is attributed to habitat loss. And what is becoming increasingly understood, but it's complex, is that deforestation is arguably one of the leading drivers of pathogen emergence. And ecosystem degradation is also linked with pathogen emergence. And there's a whole range of reasons to this. It can be changes to the host animal population. So their populations are disturbed, their abundance might change, their natural, the way that those populations interact will change. And also just by people coming into those areas, you have increased human-animal contact or human environment contact that allows the transfer of those, or spillover of those diseases. Also, when you have, and what we see this with the avian influenza, where we have a huge amount of livestock, so chickens, for example, or ducks, and they come into contact with wild birds, and then you get these outbreaks of diseases like bird flu and other similar diseases.
Yeah, no, that's really important, people to recognize the interplay and the opportunity. And Professor Keith, on the line of opportunity, I'd like to, the decision-making table, the finance ministers really hold a lot of sway, not the environment ministers. That's just the reality of the situation. So if we're speaking to the finance minister, let's just talk to them a little bit more about the opportunity cost of inaction. I'd like to delve into two things. One is, you mentioned the feedback loops, and I'd like to share a little bit about the melting tundra and the release of methane. And the second one is about, both of you have mentioned about warming oceans, but I think going down to the bottom of the food chain, looking at the reduction in phytoplankton and what that has in terms of implications up the food chain to everybody, including us.
Yeah, it's a vexed problem, because I think our decision makers have reasonably well defined responsibilities, and actually very few of them are at the global scale. They're below that as a rule, and so there needs to be a better understanding that these global scale issues that require attention locally actually affect livelihoods and economics locally as well. And I think we're learning that hard lesson here in Australia, because our economy is not as strong as it could be, even given the pandemic. And I was actually just watching an economic analysis a couple of nights ago, showing the decline of our GDP, the decline of take-home wages in real terms, and so on. That's been happening in Australia for a little over a decade now, and that translates into social quality of life. People are not experiencing the same kind of life that they were. 10 years ago in terms of opportunities, being able to relax, avoid stresses and tensions that are brought on by economic circumstances. And the commentator that was giving this analysis put these trends down to uncertainty, business uncertainty, and that is certainly something that finance ministers do worry about. It's one of the things that does keep them awake at night, and so they should be looking for solutions to improving levels of certainty, not only in the business community, of course, but elsewhere. Because what's happened is that without certainty, investment's dried up. And the commentator's diagnosis of what the major driver for that dry up in investment due to lack of certainty was a lack of certainty over climate change policy. Businesses are not investing because they don't understand which direction policy will go in order to deal with this inevitable crisis. And so governments need to step up and make decisions, progressive decisions that give that certainty, and at the same time progress us towards solutions to these global scale problems that are beyond any single decision maker.
Right. No, and if you made the great point about the arc of political decision making, and so Professor Nicholson, I'd like to, if you could follow on that, what would be the value proposition that you would give to local and also national policymakers with regard to protecting ecosystems? What's the value proposition, and conversely, what's the cost of inaction?
I think one of the key things is just making these links between us and nature clear for everybody. Not that it's not just a good to have, but we really depend on it. About half of GDP globally is estimated to depend closely on nature. So in part, this is a communication issue. I think that people understanding those links. On a more positive note, I think we can also try and switch the narrative from one of despair to one of optimism. And I know that for me, the last couple of years especially has been, or the last decade really, has been such a challenge with pandemic, but also this knowledge of the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think if we are able to show the evidence that our actions can reduce threats and reverse biodiversity loss, I think that helps. And in particular, showcasing leadership and political will that show that change is possible, whether we're looking at other policies, the Montreal Agreement on ozone depleting chemicals, that mean that we don't just throw up our hands and allow politicians to avoid taking responsibility. We have enough evidence of where policies and international agreements can really make a difference. And even in the previous conventional biological diversity targets, the ICCN targets, we largely failed in meeting those targets. But there are glimmers of hopes of where some of these policies and some of the actions change the trajectory of species loss, for example. So there are well-documented cases where we made a positive impact, even if we didn't quite get to the goal that we wanted to. Every additive, every piece of the puzzle, every bit that we can add is going to be better than the loss that we had. And it's similar to climate change. Every action we take will improve things. And I think finding a way to communicate the benefit of doing so and the effectiveness of the actions that we have in a very complex world will be really important. But I think it's not just about communicating. I think scientists have this terrible habit of thinking, well, if we just tell everybody, they'll all come to their senses. And that's not true. We should be a bit more cynical than that. So above all, it's going to take some really strong leadership and vision, and at many levels, from small communities, individuals, local governments, and then international agreements, but also across sectors. And I think David alluded to the fact that in Australia, we haven't seen great leadership on climate change and the environment, but we're seeing the private sector, civil society stepping up and providing that leadership and providing that push and forcing the government or dragging them into making policy. And so we are collectively, providing that leadership that perhaps is lacking at higher levels. And I think that's a really positive thing to look for and to look at and try and learn from. And in particular, I've got real optimism. I've got 3 kids, and their attitude and the things that they're learning is just completely different from my generation. So that gives me optimism. If we can not stuff up the world before they grow up and take charge, then it'll be a better place. Maybe we should hand it to them now.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, as long as they're working with you, I'm sure that's a great team, to be sure. Professor Keith, I'll ask you this last question, then Professor Nicholson, I'll go to you, and then Professor Keith for final comments. But tell us Professor Nicholson is now arcing into the really positive, the value proposition for doing this. It's incredible. It's neglected, but it's amazingly powerful, and it definitely needs to be part of the solution. Whether it's carbon sinks to address climate change or pandemic prevention, food security, you mentioned a lot. Give us the argument that you would give, the value proposition to protecting critical ecosystems in a nutshell to the public. And then Professor Nicholson, I would ask you to do the same thing, and we'll have some closing comments. What's your elevator speech to the public?
Well, I think it's about a fundamental aspect of human nature, and that is that doing good, because by doing good we can benefit others, people that we care about, our friends and family in particular, but also a broader public. People pitch in, in crises, and they're willing to help others, even if they don't know them, never met them. People donate to various causes, to alleviate poverty, to deal with environmental disasters, such as the tsunami that affected Southeast Asia a decade ago, and so there's a fundamental aspect of human nature that drives that, and I think contributing to the continued function and diversity of the world's ecosystems by acting locally is a contribution that's much the same as that kind of generosity that underpins those kinds of actions that almost all of us are involved in, either as givers or recipients, who are obviously very appreciative. So by doing that, we're not only helping those around us and those beyond us that we've never met, but we also have a temporal dimension to that as well that Emily alluded to, and that is the next generations that are coming. And we can look back in history and think about the good things that were bequeathed to us, and also some not so good things in history that don't make us so proud. And I think reflecting those kinds of things makes a value proposition that goes all the way from individuals right through governments to the global community.
That's great, and I think that's a powerful message, and that we will share with the world. And Professor Nicholson, what's your elevator speech to policymakers in the private sector? What's your elevator speech to compel them to say, here's the value proposition, here's why you should be protecting ecosystems?
So I think we need to fundamentally recognise that the benefits for people of sustaining nature and ecosystems are diverse, they're profound, and they're almost uncountable because there are so many. We all depend on nature. And importantly, most of nature's contributions are irreplaceable. So you could replace some of the benefits we get from nature with technology or infrastructure. So you can build seawalls for coastal protection instead of relying on natural ecosystems, or you can have water treatment or desalination plants to provide us with drinking water when most of our water comes from nature. But these are expensive and they serve a single purpose. Nature provides us with many benefits from a single place or a single ecosystem or a group of ecosystems together. So for example, mangroves protect coasts from storm surge and protect the people and the communities behind them. which is increasingly important in climate change as we get these extreme weather events. But they also provide habitat for biodiversity. They support fisheries and therefore livelihoods. And they sequester and hold blue carbon in the mud and also in the trees themselves. So again, they're doing another important job in climate change. No built infrastructure can do all of these things together. And ecosystems do it for free if we let them go about their own business. Also, natural ecosystems, as a conservation scientist, it's really important to me, they're critical to safeguarding biodiversity. We've only got about half of the pre-industrial area remaining of ecosystems, but they support 86% of the diversity of ecosystem types, so the diversity in our environments. 95% of threatened species are supported by natural ecosystems, and the genetic diversity that we rely on for over the majority of our medicines as well. So these are really critical. The only way to sustain biodiversity and these benefits is to protect the ecosystems that provide them and to restore them when they're degrading or lost. And I think that if we can identify which ecosystems are at greatest risk of losing that biodiversity and those benefits that we get from them, that allows us to prioritise actions that we need to sustain these benefits and these important values that we hold.
No, thank you very much, Professor Nicholson and Professor Keith. Those are powerful closing comments that people should adhere to. And for all of us watching this interview, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to get behind and inform the public and policymakers of what the benefits are in terms of protecting ecosystems, not only as a mechanism to address the existential threat of climate change, but also importantly for our food, our water, and the life. These are the life support systems for all life, including our own. If we fail to protect them, then we're actually destroying the essentials for our own lives. And there's one thing about extinction and the extinction crisis we're faced with. Extinction is forever. So when a species is gone, it's gone forever, and all the impacts that that species has across nature. And we don't know what those are. So we're in a critical, challenging moment right now. All is definitely not lost, but we have to act with speed and with effectiveness, and using the IUCN's tools that they have that are open to all, that decision makers at any level of government can use those to be able to sustainably and sensibly use the ecosystems that are within their purview. So thank you very much for joining us today at the CUGH Leadership Interview Series.